Out of combat units movement. I was not really planning to implement the overworld navigation in this series, but since a lot of you asked for it, I'm pretty much obligated to do it, so that's what we're gonna start today. And the first step is going to be to spawn the units in the world independently of the combat system, and then we're also going to ask them to move, and we're gonna use the Unreal navigation system to do that. And yeah, that's actually a lot of work to do, so let's get to it. So in Unreal, the first step I'm gonna do is actually to re-import all my platforms in my different environments right here. As you can see, my collisions are not really perfect for overworld navigations because right now they are only overlapping the upper part of my platform. So if I'm using my platforms like I'm doing right here, we can see that there's a little gap between the collision of that platform, which is the line that we have right here, and the bottom platform. And that's not good because we're going to use the navigation system that comes with Unreal, and it doesn't like that when there's a gap between the collision. So we're just going to re-import all of our platforms with new meshes that have proper collision. So I'm just going to go in my platforms folder right here where I have all my meshes, and I'm going to take all my FBXs. I have a few FBXs right here that I'm going to drag in Unreal and use to re-import and override all the previous platforms. There we go. So now when I look at my platforms in the environment, we can see that the collisions are overlapping them completely all the way to the bottom right here. So good. That's going to help the navigation system to do its job. Okay, good. So now we have re-imported all the assets we're gonna need today. We're not completely done with the environments. We're gonna come back to them later, but for now, I just wanted to use the beginning of the video to re-import all the assets we're gonna need the same way I usually do. That way, we don't have to think about them later on in the video. So good. Now we have all the assets we need and we can start working on the project. And the first thing we need to do is to change a few things in the units, because right now our units are not really made to work in the overworld. They are only going to work in combat, and if we try to move them in the overworld, it's not gonna work at all. We're gonna have a bunch of errors. So yeah, we have to change a few things in them so they don't cause any problem when we try to move them outside of the combat. So I'm just gonna start by going in my units folder, so units right here, and I'm gonna start by creating myself a new enum to keep track of if the unit is in a combat context or an overworld context, because the unit is going to behave differently in both those cases. And with an enum, it's going to be simple to switch between those. So I'm gonna go in my utilities folder right here and create myself a new enumeration that I'm gonna name e_unit context. And in there, I'm going to create myself 3 new elements. So here they are. I have my non-context in the case that the unit is just disabled or waiting to be assigned to somewhere. And then I have the overworld context when the unit is moving in overworld, and then the combat context when the unit is moving on the grid and casting some spells. Perfect. Now we can close the enum and go assign all that in the unit itself. And to do that, well, we're just going to create ourselves a new variable of type eUnitContext that we just created. I'm going to name it context, and then I'm going to create myself a function to set that variable because we're going to enable and disable some things when we do that. So let's create a new function for it. I named the function setUnitContext, and I'm feeding it the context as input, and we're going to use that function to set the context of our units. But before we do that, I'm just going to also use this function to disable all the features that were active before setting the context. So I'm going to add myself a little sequence here to disable all the features we were currently using, and then we're going to set the context and enable all the new features we need. And to do that, I'm going to add myself a little switch to know what was the previous context. So was it none? Was it overworld? Was it combat? And in this case, the only things I want to disable is in the case that I was in combat before. So in the case that I was in combat, it's possible that if I go in the graph right here, it's possible that this timeline was still active. So the unit was currently moving following a path in combat. And that could cause an issue in the case that you are switching your unit from the combat mode to an overworld mode. In that case, you just want to be able to control your unit freely in the world. You don't want the unit to keep following the path that it was currently following. That will not be great. So what I'm going to do is just stop the timeline. That way you can move the unit freely in the overworld and it's not going to fight with that timeline that was currently running in the background. So let's go back in the set unit context right here. And we're simply going to stop the timeline when switching the context. So if we were in combat, maybe we were following a path. In that case, I'm just going to stop the path and the unit is going to be able to move freely in the overworld. And that's it, actually. That's the only thing I want to disable when we are switching away from the combat context. And now we can set the new context. So let's set the new context right here because we don't have anything else to disable for the none or for the overworld. We don't have any other component alive right now, so we don't have to disable them, obviously. So now we're setting the new context, and now it's time to just re-enable all the components we need depending on the context we are in. So in my case, the only thing I want to enable and disable, maybe in between context, is the visibility of those components right here. The widget HP bar and the mesh theme index right here. They are two components that are really useful in in a combat context, but in an overworld context, I don't want to see the HP bar of my units, and I don't want to see the little square under their feet telling me the team index. It doesn't really matter while we are in the overworld. So I'm just going to hide them if I'm not in combat. So let's do that. Let's set them hidden in game if I'm not in a combat context. If I'm in a combat context, I want to make them visible. So that's gonna work also. If I'm in combat, it's going to make them visible. Otherwise, it's going to hide them. And the last thing I want to hide for now, for this function, it's the little robot icon above the head of the unit that are AI. It's really useful in combat. We want to know which units are controlled by the AI, but in the overworld, we don't really care. So I'm just going to do the same thing. If the unit is an AI, so if the AI is valid, I'm just going to make it hidden in game in the case that we are not in a combat context. Perfect, so now we should be able to compile and that should be done for this function right here. And now that's done, there's actually one place that I want to use it already, and it is in the event graph. I'm gonna go back in there. This is the timeline that asks the unit to move in combat, so I'm gonna go all the way at the beginning. Before asking the unit to follow a path, I'm just going to check and make sure that we are in the valid context. So what I'm gonna do is just disconnect this right here and reconnect an equal in combat right here. So if my context is equal to combat and the path is greater than 0, then in that case I'm going to walk, otherwise I'm just going to stop the unit movement because we're not in combat, obviously. And that's all the changes we needed to do for the unit to react properly when switching from a combat context to any other context. But right now the unit is never in a combat context because we're never setting the context variable, we're never calling this function anywhere. So we're gonna do that, we're gonna go call this function a few places. But before doing that, there's actually another thing I want to add, and it is a function to disable and enable the unit. We're actually doing it already a little bit. If I zoom out and go right here at the bottom, when we hide the unit after a few seconds, I'm just moving the unit all the way at the opposite side of the world so it doesn't bother us anymore. But in my case, I think it will be better if I add a function to do that and does more than just moving the unit out of the way. Maybe we could set the context back to nothing because we are disabling the unit, obviously, and that will also disable the unit movement, so that's good. And maybe we should also hide the unit so it doesn't render. So what I'm gonna do is just collapse this into a new function. So collapse the to function right here, and we can go in there to add a few things. So I renamed the function disabled unit. I'm still going to move the unit out of the way, but I'm also going to hide it in game. So the unit is completely hidden now. And I'm also going to set the unit context back to nothing. So the unit doesn't have any context because it's at the other side of the world. So we don't really care. It doesn't have any context. Makes sense. And now that we have a function to disable the unit, why not create a function to enable the unit? That's just going to be a little bit cleaner than doing it all over the place. So let's create ourselves one new function that I'm going to name enable unit. And I'm also going to feed it a context as input because it's possible that we want to re-enable the unit in combat or in overworld directly. So it's just going to be simpler if we can feed it the context directly. And I'm also going to just set it right away. So set the unit context back to that context we want to enable the unit in. So that's good. The unit is re-enabled with the right context. We just have to make it visible. So I'm going to make it back visible in the game. And the last thing I'm going to do is just to set the animation back to idle in the case that the unit was dead. So we don't re-enable a dead body. That's not really nice. We just want to make sure that the unit is nice and ready to go when we enable it. Okay, good. We can now go use those three functions to enable and make the unit active in combat. So I'm gonna go do that in the combat system, I think. So let's open the combat system, and there's a few places I want to call those functions. The first place is when we are adding the unit in combat. We want to tell it, okay, you are in a combat context now, and that is inside the add unit in combat function right here. So I'm just going to give myself a little bit of room, and now I'm gonna tell my unit that it is now in a combat context. We are adding it in combat, so it is in a combat context. Makes sense. And then I want to go in my remove unit from combat to do the opposite. I want to remove the unit from the combat context. So right here, I'm removing the unit from the combat, so I'm just going to tell it, okay, now you are in a non-context, you are not in combat anymore. And the last place I want to go in the combat system is actually in this function right here, the set unit index on grid. So let's open that one. And what I'm gonna do is go right here where we are placing the units in the world. And right here we can see that we have a select setting the unit all the way at the other side of the world when we want to disable it. And that's actually the keyword. We want to disable the unit. We don't just want to move it at the other side of the world the same way we were doing before. So what I'm gonna do is just delete that because it's not nice, it's not pretty. It's better to call the new function we just created. So I'm just going to reconnect my transform location just like that. It's nicer. And in between, I'm going to add myself a little branch. So an if right here, I'm going to connect the find like that. And if it's true, we're still going to move the unit in the world because that's what we want to do. But if it's false, well, we want to disable the unit. That's what we were doing by moving the unit out of the way. Now we're just going to do it the right way by disabling the unit. But in the case that we disabled the unit, the previous tile, so we were trying to set the unit on an invalid tile and now it is valid, then in that case, I'm just going to re-enable the unit back. So right here, I'm going to enable my unit in the case that it is a valid index. And for the context, I'm just going to set it to combat directly because we are in a combat context right now. And that's it. That's everything we needed to do to prepare the unit, actually to pre-prepare, because there's still a lot to do. Anyway, let's just go back in the combat to make sure that we didn't break anything, actually. So I'm just going to add a few units in there, and I'm also going to add a few enemies to be able to start the combat. And then if I move around, we can set it seems to work. I'm still able to cast spells. As usual, I can move and my turn. The AI, oh, I don't have any AI, so that's normal, I guess. Just going to add myself a few AI, I guess, to be able to test them. So a few AI, here we go. Start my combat again and my turn a few times, and the AI should be able to play their turn. Good. That seems to work, everything is back to normal. We just cleaned up the code a little bit and added ourselves the possibility to add another context for the units. Good, so now we can stop this and go do the next step, which is actually to break the unit once again. So let's go back in the unit, and the reason I'm saying we're gonna break the unit is because we're gonna change the base class of the unit. So if you go in the class setting right here, you have the parent actor class right here in the top right corner. Right now we are using an actor, so a basic actor, but we want to use the default navigation system that comes with Unreal, and the best way to do that, actually the simplest way to do that, is to use a children of a character, and right now it's not a character, so we cannot use that. So it's time to convert our blueprint to a character, and that might cause a few issues. So I'm just going to search for character. Actually, I'm not going to loop through all of them. So here we go, I have the character right here. So let's change that. Unreal doesn't give us any warning, that's good, but we can see on the left that we have a few new components. We have now a capsule component, a narrow component, and a mesh component, and also a character movement, which is what we're gonna need to move around the world using the default navigation system. But let's take a look at those three new components that we have right here. If I go back in my viewport, we can see that, okay, we now have a capsule under the units. Okay, so it's under the units, that's not good. And we have a second mesh in there, that's not good either. We don't want to have two skeletal meshes, we just want to have one. That doesn't make sense otherwise. So what we have to do is to pretty much delete the previous skeletal mesh we were using and use the new one instead, because we cannot delete the new one. It's inherited, it's coming from the parent, and we cannot delete components that are coming from the parent. We just have to use them, actually. So I'm just going to replace the skeletal mesh we have everywhere in the code by the new mesh we have right here. So I'm just going to do a find references on the skeletal mesh and go in all those locations right here. Actually, I just have 4 locations, that's good, and replace them by the new mesh. So right here, skeletal mesh, replace it by the new mesh. Here we go. Go to the next one, replace it by the new mesh. Go to the next one, replace it by the new mesh. And the last one, replace it by the new mesh. Now if I compile, okay, it seems to be back to normal. If I go back in my viewport, okay, my unit turned around. Okay, that's fine. I'm just going to select the previous mesh, the old mesh we were using, the skeletal mesh, and we can see that it doesn't have anything visible on it anymore because we're applying all the settings to the new mesh. That's good. I can now just delete this old mesh. We don't need it anymore. We're now left with just one new mesh. That's good, but it's not oriented properly. If we look at the arrow right here, it's pointing to the right, and now my unit is looking that way, and that's not good. So I'm just going to rotate it a little bit so it faces the right direction, and it's also not the right height because that's the floor. The bottom of the capsule is the floor, so we have to move the unit down a little bit just so it matches with the floor. I mean the bottom of the capsule. So now I'm just going to zoom in there. Okay, the capsule is right here, and it's a bit small, I think, so I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger. So select the capsule component on the left, and right now the half height is 88. I'm just going to make it 100, and the radius I'm just going to make it 50. Why not? I think it makes sense for my unit. It's a bit smaller, but I think it's fine. So okay, now I have my capsule and my unit. They are looking in the right direction and they are at the same height. That's good. But now to make them align properly together, I had to move the unit down 100 units actually. So I'm gonna do the same thing with the other components. So I have my collision line of sight. I'm going to move it down by 100, so minus 100, which is leading it to 100 units. Here we go. And then I have my HP bar. I'm gonna do the same thing, minus 100 at the end. And finally, the mesh team index, same thing. So in the Z, I'm just going to do minus 100. Here we go. So now everything should be back to what they were before. And now, just for fun, let's go see how it looks in the game. So I'm just going to play and add a few units in combat. So here they are. I have my few units right here, and I'm going to do the same thing right there. Here we go. Now I can start my combat. And okay, if I zoom, we can see that now the units are going through the ground. That's not what I want. I don't want my units to go through the floor. That's not great. And the reason behind that is just because we actually just changed the height of our unit. So now when we place the unit in the world, we are setting the actor location to the same location as before. We didn't change anything, but now the mesh is 100 units lower than what it was before. So we have to readjust a few things here and there to make sure that the mesh is standing on top of the grid. And we cannot actually just move the mesh back up or move the capsule up. It doesn't work that way. We have to use the default capsule. We have to use it and make sure that the rest of the game works around those conditions. So I'm just going to stop right here and I'm going to go back in the BP unit. And now the problem is just that the unit is 100 units lower than before. And the only solution we have for that is to just move everything back up 100 units, and that's not fun. And since we're going to have to do that multiple places in the code, so when we are moving the unit on the grid, when we are spawning the unit and things like that, I'm just going to create myself a new function that adds that distance on top of the previous distance we wanted to apply to the unit. So I named the function add capsule height because that's what we want to do. We want to take the position we wanted to apply to the unit, add the height of the capsule to that position, and then return the position plus the height. And that's exactly what we're going to do. It's simple. It's just to take the vector we receive as input. So the position we wanted to apply at the beginning, add the height of the capsule, obviously, and then return it as output. And I'm also going to make sure that the function is pure right here in the top right corner. And now we can go call this function everywhere we are moving the unit on the grid, and that's actually just in two places. The first place is in the event graph right here, where we are setting the unit location in the world. So at the beginning right here, we are setting the next transform, so where we want to set the unit on the grid. Right now we are using the location of the tile, which is flat with the ground, but we have to add the height of the capsule. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm just going to add my new function right here in the middle. So I'm taking the tile, the transform of the tile, I'm going to add the height of the capsule, and then we're going to use that as a new location for the unit. And the second place is in the combat system right here. I don't know if you remember, we were just there. We are setting the location of the unit on the grid directly. And same thing, we are using the location of the tile, the height of the tile, but that's not good enough. So we have to also add the capsule height right here before setting the actor location, and that should fix the issue. So let's go back in the game to see how it looks. So let's add a few units again. Here we go. I have a few units. Okay, that's good, kind of. Okay, I have my units. Now if I move them, at least they are on top of the ground, so that's pretty good. But now I still have that little plane right here. Okay, so we moved the unit back in the air, but the plane followed. Okay, that makes sense somewhat, but it's too high now. Okay, let's go see what's happening. I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna go back in the unit, and the height of the plane, I think I'm just going to search for it. So I have my plane right here, team index, fin references, and I have it right here in the set grid. And actually, I think that's here. Yeah, that's here. We are setting the relative location of the plane. In my case, I'm just going to subtract the height of the capsule because that plane, I want it to be down instead of up. So I'm just going to do a minus right here, minus float, and I'm just going to grab the height of my capsule. Get half capsule height, here we go, just like that, and that should fix the height of the plane. I'm just gonna go back in the game to make sure, add my units, add my units on the grid, and now the plane is aligned with the ground, and it's going to be a little bit more obvious if you make it red, like that. Here we go. So now the plane is flat with the ground as before. Perfect, so that fixed the issue. And that means that we can now start working on the real subject of today's video, and it is to add the units in the overworld and then move them around. And to do that, well, we're gonna need a few new actions, a few new buttons in the user interface, and also a new tab in the debug menu. So let's go create them. I'm gonna start with the action, so I'm gonna go in my action folder right here, and we're gonna create a new folder for the overworld action. So create a new folder right here, overworld. The first action I'm gonna create is the action to add the unit in the world. overworld. So I'm going to actually duplicate an action that already exists. So in the combat setup right here, we have the action add remove unit from combat. We're going to do the same thing, but for the overworld. So I'm just going to copy this action inside the overworld folder. Here we go. And I'm going to rename it add remove unit from overworld instead of combat. Here we go. So now we have the action to add and remove unit from the overworld. I'm just going to open it. We're going to edit it a little bit later. And now I want to create an action to be able to move the unit in the overworld. So I'm just going to go back in my actions folder, right click on BP action, create a new child blueprint class and rename it action underscore move unit in overworld. And now I'm just going to also move it inside the overworld folder. Here we go. I'm also going to open the blueprint. We're going to modify it in a little bit. Now we need a new button in the user interface to select which unit we want to add into the overworld. So I'm just going to go in my debug menu action in the user interface and duplicate the button that we already have. So the button action underscore add remove unit from combat, duplicate that one. And instead of adding and removing units from the combat, I'm going to remove them from the overworld. Here we go. So add remove unit from overworld and open the widget. We're going to modify it also. So good. Now we have the new actions, the new button we need, and now we just have to put them into a tab that we're then going to add into the debug menu. So let's create the new tab we're gonna need. We're gonna need a new tab for the overworld action. I'm going to duplicate one that already exists. So let's say the console command, it's the simplest one. So tab underscore console command, I'm going to duplicate it and rename it tab underscore overworld. And now I'm just going to open the tab, we're going to modify it. And finally, we want to add that tab inside the debug menu. So I'm going to open the debug menu also, so we are ready to edit everything and put the pieces together. So first thing we're going to do is create ourselves one new button for the new tab. So let's duplicate the previous one. I renamed it the button underscore overworld, and I also changed the text written on it so it's written overworld. Then I'm going to go in my user created widget in the top left corner and add the tab overworld to my widget switcher as the last element right here. Now we can select the button overworld, go all the way at the bottom and implement the unclicked event to select the right tab, which I'm just going to do like that. I'm going to select the tab 7, which is the new tab we just created. And finally, we have to go assign the color of the button when the tab is selected. So that's inside the update button color right here. I'm going to add a new element to my make array to add my new button. So the button overworld right here. Here we go. So now we can compile and save and close the W debug menu because we're done with it. Now for the tab overworld, the first step is just going to be to delete everything that we don't need. So all those buttons right here, I'm just going to delete them. And then if I compile, I should have an error in the graph. So I'm just going to go in the graph and I'm also going to delete all that because we don't need anything. We want to start from scratch. Now we can go back in the designer, and now that the tab is completely empty, we can start modifying it and add all the components we need. So I just changed the text written on the tab. I named it the actions. Here we go. And now we're going to drag the actions we want in there. So I'm going to start by the action add remove unit from overworld. I'm going to drag that in the vertical box right here. Here we go. So I have my new action. And for the second one, for the action to select and move the unit, I'm just going to use a default button. So the button action right here, I'm going to add it to my vertical box. Here we go. So here is my new button. On the right, I've changed the text written on the button. So it's written select the slash move unit in overworld. And for the action, the first action is action underscore select tile and unit. And the second action, the right click action, is move a unit in overworld. Perfect. So now we can compile and save and close the tab overworld because we're done with it. Now for the button action add remove unit from overworld, I'm going to change a few things in the designer. First thing, I'm going to change the text that is written on the button. So add remove unit overworld instead of just add remove units. Then for the left and right click action, I'm going to change them to add the remove unit from overworld. Here we go, both of them. Then the unit bar is pretty good. We're going to keep it there. Then I have my spin box for the themes. We're not going to use that today, but I'm just going to keep it because I know we're going to reuse it in the future. And finally, for the use AI checkbox, I know that we're not going to use that anymore, so I can just delete it. Now, if I compile, I should see that I have some errors in the log, so I'm just going to go in the graph and we're going to fix that. The first thing we're going to do is delete that event right here because we don't have the checkbox anymore. Same thing for the checkbox in the visibilities. Here we go. Now I'm going to go on the right here. We're going to disconnect the checkbox also because it doesn't exist anymore. And finally, we have to replace those casts right here to the new action we assigned to the button. So we can just delete all that, and then we're going to replace them with the new action. So let's cast to the add remove unit from Overworld. This time I'm going to say that I want to add the unit right here, then I'm going to tell it the unit type and also the team index, even though we're not gonna use that today. Okay, then at the bottom I'm just going to cast to the same action, so the add remove unit to Overworld, and I'm going to say that I don't want to add the unit for that one. And that's it. Now we can compile and save, and we're done with the user interface. Now we can start focusing on the action. So let's close the button, and I'm gonna go inside. The first action I'm gonna do, let's say it's going to be the add remove unit from Overworld, because if we want to be able to move them, we have to add them first. And there I'm just going to go inside the execute action, and we're gonna replace a bunch of things in there, actually most of it. So I'm just going to delete all that, let's say. And then I'm going to zoom right here to start the new logic, and I'm gonna start by deleting the use AI boolean right here, because we're not gonna use it at all. Perfect. Now let's compile, and we're ready to start working on the new logic. So for this action, we either want to add a new unit in the world or remove a unit that is already existing in the world. And since it's actually way easier to remove a unit, I'm just going to start with that one, and that's it. That's super simple. We just have to take the unit that is currently under the mouse. If it is valid, then just destroy it. That's it. The unit is removed from the world. And now to add the unit in the world, that's a little bit more complicated. So the first step actually is just to check if the index that is under the mouse is actually valid, because we don't want to add a unit in the case that the index is equal to -99, -99, which can mean anything. So the mouse can be pretty much anywhere, and we don't want to add a unit in that case. So we're just going to add a new unit in the world in the case that the index is valid. And in that case, I'm just going to move on the right a little bit. We're going to do a line trace under the mouse cursor. So get hit result under cursor by channel, and the channel we want is ground and grid modifiers, because we want to spawn the unit on the ground, obviously, and we only want to spawn the unit if the mouse is over the ground. So that's good. If it's true, I'm just going to break the hit result and save it into a new local variable right here, a hit location, and we're going to use that hit location to position the unit in the world. But first we have to spawn the unit. So I'm just gonna move on the right here and do a spawn actor. The actor is gonna be a BP unit, obviously. I'm going to leave the transform empty for now. I'm going to tell you why in a second. I'm just going to make sure that the collision is always spawn. Ignore collision, otherwise it will not work in the case that we are spawning a unit in the ground, which is actually what we are doing right now. If we are spawning a unit at 0, 0, 0 in the world, there's a big chance that it spawns in the middle of the ground. So that's why we have to make sure that the unit always spawns and ignore the collision, otherwise it will not work. And obviously we have to feed it the unit type of the unit we want to spawn. I'm going to take that new unit and save it into a new local variable right here. And now the reason why I'm not connecting the hit location to my spawn transform location right here is just because this hit location right now is actually flat with the ground, and that's not good. And that's actually the same exact problem we fixed 10 minutes ago when we were moving the unit a little bit higher above the grid, and that's just because of the capsule that we added in the unit. So in this case, I'm just going to ignore the transform location. Doesn't really matter, because we're going to re-overwrite it right after that. We're going to take the unit and take the hit location, and then we're going to ask the unit to add the capsule to that hit location, and then we're going to be able to set the actor location of the unit. That way the unit is going to be aligned properly with the ground. Perfect. So now there's just one last little thing to do, and it is to tell the unit that it is in the context of Overworld, because we are spawning the unit in Overworld. Perfect. So now let's compile, save, and I think we're ready to test that in the game. So let's play. I'm gonna click on my Overworld tab that we didn't test yet. It seems to work. That's good. I have my two actions right here. If I select my first action, I can select which type of unit I want to spawn, and if I left click on the grid, we can see that I'm now able to spawn a ranger. That's good. Same thing for chicken and all the other unit types. Great. So it seems to work perfectly. That's good. Now if I right click on the units, okay, I'm not able to destroy them. That's not a good thing. I should be able to destroy them. And actually, the units are not even highlighted when I move my mouse over them, so that's not good. And I think the issue might be in the collision of the unit, because we changed a bunch of things in the unit mesh and things like that, and we didn't make sure to fix the collisions afterwards. So I'm just going to stop and go back in the BP unit. We're gonna go in the viewport to try to fix the collisions. And that's gonna be on the mesh. And here, if I go in the collision, now it is using the collision preset, the character mesh, which is not the one we want. I'm just going to make it custom instead. I'm going to ignore everything except the unit channel. So I'm just going to block the unit channel. There we go. So that should fix the issue. I'm going to go back in the game, add a few units in the overworld. And now if I do a right click, it should remove the unit. Here we go. It seemed to work. Now the next step will be to select and move the units in the overworld. So I'm just going to add a few units right there, and then we're going to try to select them and then move. Okay, well, I cannot even select the unit because I don't know why it's not really working. That's great. Okay, let's go fix that, and that's going to be, I think, in the player action. And actually, I just have it right here. So I'm just going to open a BP player action, and we're going to go in the function that selects the unit. So over and selected right here, we have the set selected tile and unit. So inside this function, we can see at the beginning that it is using an index to determine which unit should be selected. And in our case, since the unit is not on the grid, it's in the overworld, it doesn't have an index associated to it. So we're gonna have to change this function a little bit just so we are able to select a unit without having to go through the grid. And the simplest way to do that is by simply adding the unit we want to select as input. So I'm just going to add myself one new parameter right here for the unit we want to select. So it is of type BP unit and it contains a unit. I'm just going to make it second, just it's a little bit nicer. Here we go. So now we have the index and the unit. And then to use that variable, I'm just gonna go down right here where we are setting the new unit we want to select. And instead of using the unit that is on the tile, if we receive a unit as input, we're going to use that one instead. So I'm just going to take my unit right here, check if it is valid. And if it is valid, well, I'm going to use it to set my new unit. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep doing what I was doing before, which is using the unit that is on the tile. And now there's just one other thing that I'd like to do with this function. If I go back at the beginning right here, if we receive a unit as input, what I would like to do is to select the index associated with that unit the same way we were doing before. So before we were receiving an index as input that was selecting the right unit associated to that index. Now we're going to do the opposite. If I receive a unit as input, we're going to also select the associated index. That way the function is going to work both ways. Either we feed it an index or a unit, and it's going to work either way. So here I'm just going to need a little bit of space, so I'm going to do that right here. And the first step is just going to be to promote the index into a new local variable. Variable that I named the desired index right here, and now we have a variable that we can modify depending if we receive a valid unit as input, and that's exactly what we're going to do. If I receive a valid unit as input right here, I'm just going to check if my unit is valid, and if so, I'm going to use the index of that unit to set the desired index back. Otherwise, I'm just going to use it as is, which is going to use the index we receive as input directly. And now the last step is to simply use the desired index instead of the index we received as input before. So right here, we have an example of that. We have the index, we were using it directly. Now I'm just going to replace it by the new desired index we created. So here it is, my desired index, replace the previous index. And then I have it right here also on the right, and that's it. These are the two places we were using the index directly. Now I'm using the desired index instead. Perfect. So now we should be able to compile and save and use this function to select a unit without going through the grid. But it's not really the case yet because we're never feeding it the unit because it's a new variable. We just created it, so nothing is using it anywhere in the code. So we're just going to go feed it when we are calling this function, and that is inside the action that selects the unit on the grid. So I'm gonna go in my action, in my grid action. Right here we have the action select tile and unit, and right here we are only feeding it the index. Now I'm also going to feed it the unit that is over. So get over the unit from the player action, and now I can feed that to the function, and that should be enough to select it. Now I'm just gonna go test it in the game, so let's try it. I'm going to add a few units in the overworld, and now if I click on them with my second action that selects the unit, we can see that they are now selected. Yes, it seemed to work. Perfect. And now the next step is to ask them to move when we do a right click. So let's stop and go do that inside the action move unit in Overworld. Oh, actually, before we are able to do that, we need to go create an event in the unit so we are able to ask the unit to move in the world. Otherwise, the unit is not gonna know what to do. So let's go back in the unit right here. I'm gonna go in my graph, and I'm gonna go all the way at the bottom to create myself one new custom event right here, event underscore move unit in Overworld. So we're gonna call this event when we are asking the unit to move in the Overworld, and the location I'm feeding as input is the location we want the unit to go to when we are asking it to move. So we are telling it, okay, go there, go there, go there, and the unit should be able to move in the overworld and go to that specific location. So good, now we have the event we can call in our new action. So let's go back in the action. To call it real quick, I'm gonna go in my function and override the execute action the same way we did before. I'm just going to move on the left right here and delete the parent action. And then the logic of the action is really simple. The first step is to check if we have a unit selected, otherwise we cannot ask it to move, obviously. Then we're gonna do a line trace to check if the mouse is over the ground. So we are gonna check if the mouse is over ground and grid modifiers to be able to ask the unit to move, because we don't want to ask the unit to move in the void, obviously. And then if that succeeded, if we hit something, if we hit the ground, then we're just going to feed that location to the unit and ask it to move in the overworld. And that's it for the logic of the action. Now we can go focus on the event itself. The event that is moving the unit in the overworld. And actually, I'm going to split that logic in 3 different steps. I'm going to have the first step, which is to ask the unit to move in the world. Then we have a second event right here, which is asking the unit to stop moving in the world. That's going to be useful every time we want to ask the unit to stop moving in the world. Anyway. And then the third step is just the action itself. So the action to walk in Overworld right here. So that way we are able to ask the unit to either start moving, stop moving, and then there's the action right here. I think it's just a little bit cleaner to have it in its own little function. And now for the logic, so when we are asking the unit to move in the overworld, the first thing I'm going to do is actually to ask the unit to stop moving in the overworld, because if the unit is already moving, we just want to do a little break, say stop, okay, we receive a new information, we have a new location where you have to go, so just stop your current movement because we're going to feed you a new location. Then the second step is to check and make sure that we are in an overworld context, because we don't want that event to fire in the case that we are in a combat, for example. So I'm just checking to make sure that we are in the overworld, and if it is the case, I'm just going to promote this location into a new variable right here, the target location in overworld. That way the unit is always going to know where it has to go in the overworld. So I just promoted that into a new variable, and now that I have my new variable, I can simply ask the unit to move in the overworld by calling the walk in overworld function. And actually right here, the first thing I'm going to do is recheck to make sure that we are still in the overworld context, because this event is going to be called by some other places in the code later on. So this check right here is not going to be enough. So I'm just going to make sure once again that we are in an overworld context. And if so, and now I can finally ask my unit to start walking, because that's where we are. We are at the step where we are asking the unit to move. So let's just set its animation back to walk, and the unit is going to start walking. And finally, to ask the unit to move, we have to go through the AI controller. That's the object that is going to be responsible to ask the unit to move around in the world. So let's just get the AI controller of the current actor, which is the current unit, and then we can simply ask it to move to a location or an actor in the world. And in our case, we want it to move to a target location, which is the location we have right here, the target location in Overworld. So that's easy, we just have to feed it to the function. Here we go, so now the unit should be able to move in the world. One last thing though, when the movement is completed, so when the unit reaches its target or reaches an obstacle that prevents it from finishing its movement, one of those 2 pins are going to be called. So on the request fail or on move finished, those 2 pins are going to be called, one of them. And in neither of those cases, I'm just going to call the stop moving unit in Overworld. That way we can reset all the variables of the unit and maybe set its animation back to idle because it's done moving. So let's just reset it right there. So yeah, when asking the unit to move in the world, we're just going to save the location we want the unit to go. Then we're going to ask the unit to start moving, sets its animation back to walk, and then we're just going to ask the AI controller to move. Once its job is completed, it's going to call the stop moving in the overworld, which is going to reset the unit. Which is actually super simple to do. The first thing I'm going to do is just reset the variable of the target location in the overworld, just so we know that the unit is not going to any random location in the world. Then I'm also going to reset its animation state back to an idle animation because it's done walking. And finally, I'm just going to reset the AI controller movement because it's done walking, we don't need it anymore. So let's just ask it to stop its movement. So here it is, I'm taking my AI controller once again and I'm just doing a stop movement on it. That way it's just going to stop its movement. And it's also going to help us in the case that we are trying to ask the unit to move to another location while the unit was already moving. We are first going to stop its movement, so it's going to cancel the previous request and then start a new request. And that's it. Now we should be able to ask the unit to move in the overworld. There's just one last thing to do though, and it is to create the AI controller because it's not created by default all of the time. And to do that, I'm just gonna go in my class default right here, and I'm going to scroll down until I get to the pawn categories right here. And the variable I'm looking for is the auto process AI. And right now it is when we are placing the unit in the world. So when we are placing the unit actor in the world while being in the editor, not while being in game. So let's let's just change that to place in the world or spawn. That way it's just going to spawn an AI for us every time we spawn a unit in the game, and that should be good enough. Now we should be able to compile and save and go add a unit in the overworld to see the result. I'm gonna go add my unit. Okay, it falls through the floor. Okay, that's not great. Okay, at least, okay, it seems to work sometime. It's weird. Okay, and now if I try to select it and move it, okay, it doesn't work. Yeah, that's not good. And that's just because I don't have any navigation in my level right now. So if I stop and I go in my top left corner right here, I have the show option and I can decide to show the navigation right here. And as you can see, even if I toggle the navigation right now, it doesn't display anything different in the editor because I don't have any navigation mesh in my levels. So I'm just going to add a nav mesh in all of my levels. So I have my square, triangle, and hexagon levels. I have to double click on the square first because that's the one that's visible. And we're going to add the nav mesh inside it. So in the place actor, I'm going to search for nav mesh and drop the nav mesh bound volume in my level. I'm just going to center it in the middle of the world and make it big enough so it covers everything. So let's say 200 by 50, 500, whatever. As long as it's big enough to cover the whole level. Okay, that's good. But it doesn't seem to cover the real ground. It just covers the plane that I have right there that is hidden. Yeah, that's weird. We have to fix the collisions on all of our ground meshes. So all the platforms, the little bridges right here, right there. So I'm going to select all my meshes right here. I can select them in the outliner. It's going to be a little bit faster. So all of those, plus the obstacle, no obstacle. I think I have pretty much everything. Yeah, I guess that's it. And now with everything selected, I'm gonna go right here on the right and I'm gonna scroll until I get to the collisions right here. And by default, it's using the world static collisions, which are fine, but it's not including the pound channel, and the nav mesh only works with the pound channel, sadly. So we just have to block the pound channel. Here we go. So now we have green all over the place because the unit is able to move on all that ground that we can see. It's not really great though. We still have that green plane on the background. That's a bit weird. I don't know if it's my background or it's just the other object that I have. I know that I have a plane right here. That plane, I think that plane, I'm just going to hide the collision. So no collision. Here we go. So now my level is fine. I can move my units on the ground. Actually, it should work. So I'm just going to save, make sure everything is saved properly and go back in the game. I'm going to add my unit in the overworld as before. Okay, now the units are not falling through the ground. So that's pretty good. And now if I ask them to move, okay, they're still not moving. That's not good. I'm just going to eject to see the result of my nav mesh. Okay, it doesn't seem to be visible anymore. Oh, that's not good. Okay, we have to fix that. Oh, but when I stop, it comes back. Okay, I think that's just because the nav mesh is not dynamic by default. As you can see here, the nav mesh was placed inside a sub-level that is dynamically loaded in the game, and it's not inside the persistent level. So that's why it's not regenerating itself while the game is running. I'm just going to go in the project settings to change the setting of the nav mesh. So on the left, we can go in the navigation mesh right here. And I can scroll down, scroll down, scroll down. And there's the runtime generation right here, which is static by default. We can change that to dynamic. And that should fix the issue, I think. So I'm just going to play now. Now, if I press eject, I can see that I have my nav mesh. And actually, if I unload my level, so if I go here and I say none to the environment, I don't have any nav mesh anymore. And now if I try to load my square, we can see that the nav mesh is loaded properly. So yeah, it's loading dynamically and it unloads when we try to load the other levels. Okay, that's good. So now if I move my unit in the world, they should move. I'm just going to, yeah, right click and the unit moves in the world. Finally. Oh wow, it took a long time, but at least the unit is moving in the world now. That's good. But now I have another issue. If I try to make my unit move on top of that little platform right here, we can see that it doesn't work. The unit just doesn't want to go on top of there, and same thing for all the other platforms. And that's because if I zoom right here, we can see that there's a little bit of a gap between the two nav meshes right here and right there. And that's just because the step the unit would have to take to get on top of that platform is a little bit too big for the nav mesh. The default step, I think it's 30 units, and in my case, I have 100 units per step in my environment, so that's not good enough. I'm just gonna go back in the project settings once again, and we're gonna fix that. There's the agent max slope, nope, agent max step height, which is the height of the steps. By default, it's 35. I'm just going to make it 110. That way it's just a little bit above the height of my steps in my game, so it should cover them properly. So I'm just gonna go back. We can see the nav mesh now overlaps all the little steps in my environment, so the unit should be able to move on top of them. So I'm just gonna place another unit and try again. I'm going to move my unit on top of this. Oh, it doesn't work either. Why? Okay, that's not good. And the reason why that happened is just because the unit doesn't know that it can go on top of those steps. The nav mesh is aware that the units can go on top of those steps, but the unit itself doesn't know. So yeah, that's just a little bit annoying, but we have to go change that inside the BP unit also. And then I can go in my character movement, and right here on the right, if I scroll, I have the walking category, which contains all the variables controlling the unit behavior while it's walking on the ground. So the first variable right here, we have the max step height. I'm just going to make it 110, the same as the nav mesh, and that's it. In my case, I'm not going to change any of the other settings that are right here, but if you want to change the unit's behavior while it's walking, this is where it is. So good, now if I play the game, I should be able to walk my units all over the place. So let's say spawn my units right here and then move right there. Okay, we can go on top of that. If I click all the way over there, we can see that the units goes up, 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 and up, and then if I click down, the unit goes down 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, and it finds the proper path all the way around my obstacles. That's pretty good. There's just still a few things to change. The first one is just that the unit, yeah, it can walk on top of the empty spaces. That's not really good either, so we have to change that. And that's actually happening because of the grid modifiers. By default, they are blocking the pawn channel. If I move my grid modifier out of the way right here, we can see that the nav mesh is generated on top of it, and that's not good. So let's open the grid modifier, and we're gonna make sure that it ignores the pawn channel. So I'm selecting my static mesh on the left, go down, go down, go down. In my channels right here, I'm going to ignore the pawn. And actually, I'm also going to ignore all the other ones because I don't need them. Okay, so now I'm going to compile and go back in the level, and yeah, we can see that now the nav mesh is going around the holes in the grid. Good. So, okay, if I eject, we can see, yeah, it seems to work pretty well. But now the obstacles are not blocking the nav mesh anymore because they are ignored by the nav mesh. We can see that the unit should think that it can go through all these obstacles because they are not blocking the nav mesh anymore. So we have to change that a little bit. We're gonna make that the grid modifiers are blocking the nav mesh only if they are obstacles. So I'm gonna go right here and just like that. So if the object type is an obstacle, we're going to block the pawn channel. Otherwise, we're just going to ignore it. Now, if I compile and go back in the level once again, oh, okay, Unreal exploded. That's great, but actually that happens sometimes. So I'm just gonna press play. I think it's actually going to look better in the game. So if I eject right here, yeah, we can see that it works way better in the game than in editor. That's actually something that happens, and it's pretty annoying, but at least it works in the game, so we cannot really complain too much about it. So yeah, now the obstacles are creating holes in the nav mesh, so that's good because we don't want the units to walk on the obstacles. That should fix our issue, but just to make sure, I'm just going to process again and try with a unit. So I have my unit right here, and I'm going to ask it to walk all the way here. We can see that it walks around the obstacle and also around the holes in my grid. So good, now the unit is not flying all over the place. Perfect. So that's pretty good. Now the mechanic works pretty much as expected, but there's still a few bugs that I'd like to fix before ending today's video. So first bug is in, let's say if I try to add a bunch of units on the grid, here we go, I can add a bunch of units. We can see that actually doesn't happen too much, but sometimes the units are pushing each other. Actually, it's going to happen even more if I try to move the unit in the groups. Okay, the unit move around, and we can see that some of them are pushing the other units, and that's not really a good behavior. Whoa, woohoo! Sometimes it's a little bit funky even. Whoa! So yeah, that's not what I want. I think I'd rather have my unit just going through all the other units, no problem, without colliding with them, because it's not really stable. So I'm just gonna stop, I'm gonna go back in my BP unit, and the reason why that happens is just because my components have some collisions to them. So first component is going to be the mesh team index. That one is blocking pretty much everything, and it doesn't really need collision. So I'm just going to make it a no collision for the mesh under the unit. The HP bar doesn't have collision, that's good. For the collision line of sight, I'm just going to scroll, and it's pretty fine. I'm just going going to make sure that it doesn't block the pound channel, and it doesn't, so that's good. For the mesh, I'm just gonna check same thing, if it's blocking the pound channel, and it doesn't, so that's good. The arrow doesn't have collision, and finally the capsule component. Okay, that one is collision preset pound, and that's blocking the pound channel, and I don't want that, so I'm just going to make it custom and overlap the pound channel instead of blocking it. Perfect. Now I'm going to compile, and now the unit should be able to walk through each other no problem. So I'm gonna start by adding a bunch of units. There we go. And now if I ask them to move, we should see that, yeah, the units are walking through each other no problem. Perfect. So that first bug is now fixed. That's pretty good. The second bug that I have is if I try to spawn the units in the world, but on the edge of the worlds, like let's say right here, we can see that the units are falling forever. They are actually really falling forever. If I eject and go down under my grid, we can see, oh, hey, here are my units, and they are falling. I can catch up to them, woohoo! But they are still falling forever. They are never dying. So what we're gonna do is just add a volume under all of our levels to make sure that we are killing the units that are going to drop under the level, or actually maybe not kill them, maybe just put them back on top of the grid, because maybe we'd like to keep them. So I'm just gonna stop and add the volume. So for the volume, I'm just going to make sure to add it inside my square level, the same way I did for the nav mesh. So double click on the square. Now I'm gonna go in my place actor and search for the kill Z volume. Here it is. I'm going to drop it in the scene, and I'm going to center it in the world, the same way I did for the nav mesh. But this time I'm actually going to put it under my level. So I'm going to move it down a little bit, like all the way over here. Now it's a little bit small, so I'm just going to make it super big, like 200 by 200, to make sure that the units are overlapping it while they are falling to the void. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger just in case that the units are not triggering the volume. So here we go. Now I have my volume. You can see here that it is under the level, and when the units are going to fall to their death under the level and they are touching this volume, I'm just going to place them back on top of the level so they are not falling forever, and we're gonna do that inside the BP unit. So in the BP unit, I'm gonna select my capsule component on the top left corner, and I'm going to go in the implementables event right here, and we have the component begin overlap. So when we start overlapping the capsule, actually when the capsule starts overlapping something, I'm just gonna check if it is the kill Z volume, and if it is, we're going to respawn the unit. So when the capsule of the unit is overlapping another actor in the world, we're going to cast to the kill Z volume to see if the unit fell out of the world. And if it's the case, well, we want to put the unit back on top of the level, but we only want to do that if we are still in an overworld context. We don't want to do that if we are in combat, for example. So I'm just going to check if we are still in overworld, and if so, then I'm going to move my actor, the unit, back on top of the grid. And to do that, well, we have to first take the position of the unit right now. So we have the unit in the world. Well, it's actually under the world right now, so we have to put it back up. And to do that, we're simply going to project the position of the unit. So take the unit that is on the world and put it back on top of the world. So project the point to navigation. The point is going to be the position of the unit currently. And we're going to project it back on top of the navigation. The query extent is the size at which we want to look for to find the closest navigation area. So that's why I made it pretty big. It doesn't really matter in that case. So 500, 500. And for the height, since the unit is going to be way under the world, I made it like a super huge number. That way the unit is going to snap back on top of the world, even if it's way down there. Okay, now we have the position of the unit projected on the navigation. What I'm going to do is just re-add my capsule height. That way the unit is going to be right on top of the world at the right location. And then we can set the actor location using that output, which is simply going to replace the unit on top of the world. But right now it's not gonna work because we have to tell it which navigation data to use, and right now we're not telling it anything, so it's not gonna use anything. So let's just promote that to a variable. So the nav data, here we go, I have it right here in a new variable, and we're going to set that in the begin play. So I'm just going to zoom out and go all the way in the begin play right here, and I'm going to set my nav data using a get actor of class. So get actor of class, the class is going to be the recast nav mesh, which is the actor that is automatically spawned when we add a nav mesh in the world, and we're going to use that to set the variable. Now that variable is going to be reused when we try to move the unit on top of the grid. So now if we go back in the game, in the overworld, I should be able to spawn my units right here. they are falling into the void, and then they are teleported back on top of the grid. So here we go. My units are getting back on top of the grid, so they are not falling endlessly in the void. Perfect. So that seemed to work. And yeah, we can see here that it doesn't always work, so that's not foolproof. We have to improve that in the future, I guess. But I guess for today it's good enough because the video is getting really long. But actually, why teleporting the unit back on top of the grid when the user spawns them in the void? Maybe we should just prevent the user from spawning them in the empty space. We should just make sure that the unit is always snapped back on top of the navigation when it is spawned. So I'm just gonna stop and we're gonna do that real quick. I'm gonna go back in the BP unit. Actually, no, we're gonna go back in the add remove unit from the overworld right here when we are setting the actor location of the unit in the world. And instead of simply setting it to the it location, I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm going to do a project point to navigation using the nav data object that is inside the unit, and then plus the capsule height as before, and set the actor location. That way the unit is going to spawn right on top of the world all the time. Actually, most of the time. It's not perfect, but we can see right now that if I spawn my units, they are automatically spawned on top of the world. Obviously, it doesn't always work. We can see here that there's an issue, but whatever. It should be good enough for today at least. Most of the units should be able to spawn on top of the world, no problem. So good, another issue that's fixed. Now I'm gonna stop and I'm gonna do another thing, a new feature this time. Did you know that you could ask the unit to follow another unit endlessly? And that's actually what we're gonna do because I think it's pretty fun to do. So let's go in the move unit in Overworld, and actually we have to change something in the move unit in Overworld event right here. So let's go back in the BP unit first, and we can now add a new input to that event so we can feed it the unit we want the unit to follow in the world. So new parameter right here of type BP unit. Here it is, unit to follow, and I'm going to also promote that into a new variable. So promote to a new variable, which I'm gonna set right here, my unit to follow in Overworld, so the unit knows which unit it has to follow in the overworld. And I'm actually just going to also clear that variable when I'm asking my unit to stop moving. So I'm just going to add it right here as an empty variable, just so the unit doesn't follow anybody anymore. And finally, I should be able to just feed my unit to follow in Overworld right here to my move to location or actor, and the unit should now follow the other unit in the Overworld. Now I'm just going to compile my BP unit and go back in my action move unit in Overworld, because now we have to feed it the unit we want the unit to follow. So I'm just going to take the unit that is currently hovered under the mouse cursor. Perfect. Now if I compile and go see in the level, I should now be able to ask my unit to follow another unit. So just to make sure, I'm just going to add two units right here. The first unit is going to be my warrior. It's going to move there, and the other one is going to right click on the warrior and follow the warrior. Hey, it seems to work. Now if I move my warrior all over the place, the other unit should be able to follow it. That's pretty good until the ranger reaches the warrior and then it stops. Yeah, that's not great. And actually, if I move my warrior on top of the ranger, yeah, they are pretty close to, I think I would add a little bit of a radius around my unit so they are not just kissing each other like that. They are a little bit too close in my opinion. So yeah, I'm just going to make them stop a little bit earlier so they are not that close to each other. And also I'm going to make sure that if, let's say, I'm already following someone, I'm following the ranger right here, and even if I reach the ranger, even if it moves out of the way, here we go, and now the warrior reaches the ranger, if the ranger starts to move again, then the warrior is going to follow him until we specifically ask the warrior to stop following the ranger. So good. Okay, let's go do that. I'm gonna stop, go back in the BP unit, and we're gonna focus on the move to actor location right here. And the first thing we're going to change is the distance at which the unit is stopping when it reaches the other units on the grid. So in the case that we have a unit to follow in the overworld, we're just going to stop a little bit earlier than the target. And to do that, we can just expand the move to location or actor right here to have access to the acceptance radius. For the target location in overworld, we're not going to change anything. We're still going to keep the acceptance radius to -1, which is just the default value. But in the case that the unit to follow in overworld is valid, then we're going to increase that value. And that's what I'm doing right here. So if my unit to follow in overworld is valid, I'm going to set the radius to 100. Otherwise, it's just going to stay -1. And that should fix the issue that the unit was way too close to the other one when it was stopping its logic. So that's good. Next, I want to make sure that the unit continues to follow the other unit as long as we don't specifically ask him to stop following him. So what we're going to do is when the request failed or finished right here, we're not going to stop the unit right away. We're just going to check first first, are we following someone? If we are following someone, well, we're going to do a little bit more logic before stopping the movement. Otherwise, if we're not following someone, well, we can simply stop the movement right away because we reached the target location in the world. So, okay, good. Now we determine that we are following someone. And what do we want to do? Well, in the case that the unit we are following is valid, we're simply going to check, okay, what is my distance between myself and the other unit I'm currently following? And if that distance is smaller than 250, it means that the other unit pretty much didn't move. It's still there, right beside us. So we don't have to try to follow him. It's right there. So that's fine. So that's what we're going to do. In the case that this value is smaller than 250, we're simply going to put ourselves back in idle because, well, we don't have to follow the other unit. It's not moving. It's right there. So I'm just going to go back in idle and wait a little bit, add a little delay right here. So I'm just going to wait. Patiently wait to see if the other unit starts to move again. If it doesn't, well, we're just going to stay here, wait and wait and wait and wait. But if it moves, then after my delay, I'm just going to check, okay, do I still have to follow someone? And if so, I'm just going to start back right here. I'm going to go back in my distance to check, okay, did the unit move? If the unit didn't move, okay, I'm still going to stay in idle, wait a little bit, check, okay, do I still need to follow someone? Yes, okay, what is the distance now? It didn't move again, okay. Wait a little bit more. Okay, I'm going to wait and then come back at the beginning. Okay, now the distance increased and it's greater than 250. So what I'm going to do is simply start moving again. So I'm going to ask my unit to walk in the overworld, which is just going to reset the movement. The unit is going to start following the other one again and again and again until we specifically ask it to stop moving. And that's it, that should fix the issue. So let's go back in the game. I'm going to add myself a little unit, and actually I'm going to add myself a bunch of units because we're going to test that feature a lot. So yeah, let's go, a bunch of slimes right here. And then I'm going to ask my warrior to move. My ranger is going to follow my warrior. That's pretty good. As before, ranger is following the warrior. Okay, it reaches the warrior, stops. If I start moving my warrior again, the ranger follows him, so that's good. And we can also see that the distance at which the ranger stops following the warrior when it's getting too close makes way more sense than before. Before they were kissing each other, now they are not anymore. So that's pretty good. And if I start walking all over the place, the ranger continues to follow my warrior until I specifically ask my ranger to stop following the warrior, just like that. And now I can resume the following if I want to. And we can actually do that with as many units as we want. Right now we can see that I'm following my warrior, my ranger, and then the slimes are following each other. My priest is in the loop too. So yeah, we can have a little bit of a train of units following each other. Oh, hey, wait for me, wait for me. There we go. So now I have all my units following each other, and that's pretty nice. Yay, okay, good. The feature is now working completely and we're done with it. Good, we can stop and go back in the unit because there's still one last thing I would like to do. And that's super simple actually, but we have to do it if we want to be clean. And it's actually not much. You can just select the character movement on the left right here, and then in the top right corner you can search for activate, and by default the character movement is activated by default because the checkbox right here in auto activate is checked. So I'm just going to uncheck it because I don't want my character movement to be enabled by default. I just want to enable the character movement when the unit is in an overworld context. When the unit is in a combat context, I don't want to use the character movement. I want to use my own pathfinding instead. So that's why I'm just going to uncheck the auto activate, and then we're going to manually activate it when we are setting the unit context to be overworld. So let's go in the set unit context right here, and I'm going to zoom right here to add my little bit of code. Just like that. So on the character movement, we are doing a set active to activate it or deactivate it depending if the unit context is in overworld. So if we are in overworld, we're going to activate it, otherwise we're going to deactivate it. Perfect. So that's it for the code. We're done. But there's just one last thing to do. Once again, if I go back in my game right here and I eject, we can see that the nav mesh is generated properly for the square level. But if I go back, let's say in the other level, so I load the hexagon level, we can see now if I eject that I don't have any nav mesh for that one. And same thing for the triangle. So since I want to be able to move my unit in the overworld for all those levels, I'm going to also add the nav mesh in all of them. So let's stop and we're going to go add the nav mesh in all of them. So let's start with the hexagon. I'm going to hide my square level. And now I don't have any nav mesh, so I'm going to place the nav mesh actor. So nav mesh bounds volume. I'm going to add it in the middle of the world, the same way I did for the square. I'm going to set the scale to pretty big, same way I did for the square. And then I'm going to also set the collision on all my platforms. So I'm just going to select all of those. There we go. And then I'm going to make sure in my collisions that they are blocking the pawn channel. Here we go. We can see that it generated the nav mesh on top of the floor. And one last thing, I still have my plane right here at the bottom. So I'm just gonna scroll, find my plane where it is. Here it is. I have a plane that has some collisions on it. I'm just going to set it to no collision. Here we go. So now we have the nav mesh on the hexagon level. It's not really pretty in editor, but I assure you that in the game, if I show my level hexagon, if I eject now, I have a nice nav mesh on my hexagon level, and I can switch between the square and the hexagon, and now the nav mesh is generated properly between the levels. Now we just have to do the same thing for the triangle level. So let's stop once again. I'm gonna go in my triangle level, hide my hexagon because I don't need it. I'm going to add a new nav mesh bound volume. I'm going to center it in the world, make it big enough to cover the whole world. Here we go. And now I have to select all my platforms and make sure that they are blocking the pawn channel. Here they are. I have my nav mesh on top of the ground. I just have to cancel my plane once again. So I have the plane right here. I can simply set it to no collision. Here we go. So now I have a nice nav mesh and we're ready to test all that. Oh, actually, that's not true. There's still the kill Z volume that is missing. So I'm going to go back in my square level right here. I'm going to search for it. So kill Z volume. I have it right here. And I'm just going to copy it and paste it in the other level. So I'm going to hide my square level, go in my triangle level and paste it right here. I now have my kill Z volume. And now I can hide the triangle, go in the hexagon and paste it right here. There we go. So now all the level have their own kill Z volume. I can save all that and now we can test for real. And here we go, I think we're finally done. We are able to spawn units in the world, all kind of different units independently of the grid. That's good. Then we can also move them all over the place. So that's pretty good. We can ask them to follow other units also, and that's nice also because we can make a little train of unit. That's pretty nice. And the units are moving all over the place in the world. That's pretty good. Now we can also spawn the other worlds and see if they work. So I'm gonna switch to my hexagon level. We can see that we still have the units on top of the grid and I can still move them. Some units fell out of the world, but they respawn properly. That's pretty good. Sometimes they get stuck because they are spawned inside an obstacle, but yeah, we cannot really do something about that because yeah, we are just changing the world while they are moving. That's not good. And finally, we have the triangle. The same thing, we can move the unit all over the place and it works perfectly. That's pretty good. So yeah, I'm pretty happy for the result for today, and that video is getting pretty long. So I guess that's gonna be it for today, and I'm gonna see you in the next one. So bye bye!